Hey gang, and welcome back. Big thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sending me Innistrad Crimson Vow's Spirit Squadron deck to reveal to you for free. I think getting this deck is particularly fitting since I'm pale as a ghost. By now, chances are you've seen the face card for this deck, and that's Millicent, Restless Revenant. Millicent isn't the cheapest commander in Azorius sitting at 7 mana, but they do have some interesting abilities to help you make them cost less and get some more spirit tokens at the same time. First up, the reduction function is very similar to how Herald cares about how many creature cards you have in your graveyard, only Millicent cares about how many spirits you have on the board. This means you could potentially be casting your commander over and over again for only 1 white and 1 blue. Millicent's second ability is pretty awesome as well, since it allows you to help build up a massive board of spirit tokens, which, should she die, allows you to help cast her again easily. The ability triggers whenever a non-token spirit deals combat damage to a player and/or dies, which means that basically you have a lot of ways to get spirit tokens. This means that by running a card like True Conviction, your spirits will have double strike, not to mention lifelink, but more importantly, the double strike will allow you to get 2 spirit tokens assuming they connect during combat. The on death trigger is pretty relevant since it means that you don't have to be afraid of using a board wipe after combat to wipe the board, since you'll be getting a bunch of spirit tokens, and in turn, reducing the cost of Millicent, meaning it's even easier to cast her in your second main phase. The next legendary of the deck is Donal, Herald of Wings, and I kept calling him Donald for some reason when I was reading this initially. It's obviously a more narrow card, and its on-cast probably is to prevent blink shenanigans. The card does have a lot of restrictions, which isn't to say that it's bad, it just means that you have to be mindful of casting non-legendary creature spells that have flying. This could be very good in a Spirits deck, obviously, which is why it's in this deck, but I could also see it doing some work in a Birds deck and/or Unesh. The token that it makes isn't exclusively a spirit, it's in addition to its other types, it's a spirit added onto it. Sure, it depowers whatever the power and toughness of the creature are, but you still get an edge of the battlefield trigger, so that's something to keep in mind. Since it only happens once per turn, you need to make certain you're using it on the one you really want to use, but at the same time, you can trigger it on other people's turns just as easily, assuming you have flash. The next legendary, or should I say legendaries, have partner with, so we're including them together, and that's Rhoda, Geist Avenger, and Timon, Youthful Geist. I don't have a ton to say about these 2 legendaries, since they are a type of deck that I don't typically play, which is where it cares about tapping down creatures. I will say that the artwork is really sweet though, and look at the size of her sword. Plus you have that Timon like Navi creature kind of floating around her shoulder, which is pretty sweet. The first non-legendary creature that I want to reveal to you is a Drogskull Reinforcements, and this is basically another Spirit Lord, although potentially better since it doesn't just provide a flat +1/+1, instead it gives melee. If that wasn't good enough though, it also has Mark of Asylum added to it to boot, although with the tribal variant focusing only on spirits. White already has a ton of ways of providing +1/+1, so it's kinda sweet to see a different design space, and melee is certainly better than flat +1/+1 since it can be a potential of +3/+3, meaning those 1/1 spirit tokens can suddenly become 4/4s very easily. Next up is a Haunted Library, and it's currently one of my favorite cards from this deck. This triggers only when your opponent's stuff dies, but you can easily fill up your board after a board wipe by only having to pay 1 colorless per creature that dies to get a 1/1 spirit token. Costing only 2 mana and requiring only 1 colorless to be able to get a spirit token is very affordable. I will say this is probably the easiest one to fit into other non-spirit tribal decks, since for only 2 mana it can easily just sit on the field and wait for someone to board wipe. We've got another creature coming your way with a Priest of Blessed Graf. End of turn effects are great, and for 3 mana to potentially get up to 4 bodies by the end of your turn is even better. This card is like a white variant of Ophiomancer from Commander 2013, so I'm really down to test it out. Storm of Souls is a fun white card, although I will say for the most part, from recent sets and cards, Mono Black has had a bit of a stranglehold on mass resurrection effects. It's nice to see them branching out into different colors and testing it out, although I will say that even though it's decently costed, the downside is there. I think the 6 mana cost isn't too bad, but the hindering part of the spell is losing the power and toughness on the creatures you bring back. It does give them flying, which isn't bad, but you obviously won't want to be filling up your graveyard with massive creatures to only bring them back as little 1/1s with flying. Sudden Salvation makes me think of Faith's Reward for some reason, but it has a lot better potential. I like that you get to steal other people's permanents, but unlike Reward, you don't get to bring back all of the permanents that are destroyed, only 3. The trade-off for this though is, you could potentially draw up to 3 cards, which is pretty sweet, meaning you could in theory net 6 potential cards for only 1 that costs 4, and I think you could be doing a lot worse off for that kind of cost. Breath of the Sleepless is the other new enchantment for the deck, although it focuses heavier on the tribal element of it. This card is going to obviously work well in Millicent, and probably Orvar in Mist form, assuming you have enough changelings in the deck. It doesn't just give flash though, since if you cast creatures on your opponent's turn, you get to tap stuff down, which is kind of a fun combat trick, although for 4 mana I'd expect a bit more. At this point, blue does have a lot better options, and something like Leyline of Anticipation might be better suited if you're not leaning heavily into spirits. Possibly my favorite creature for the deck is the Ethereal Investigator, and I think this card has the most potential out of all the creatures to be included in other non-spirit based decks. The thing that I like the most about it is that it's an enter the battlefield trigger and not non-cast. You also don't have any if clauses attached to it, meaning all that this card cares about is how many opponents you have, and that's how many investigates you get. This card would do very well in a Rune, Brago, Chulane, or even Millicent deck, obviously, and would even be stronger if you had an Academy Manufacturer out when this resolved. I think it could also possibly see some action in Min, since she has a similar triggered ability which cares about drawing your second card, meaning you'll get an illusion from Min and a spirit token from this, which isn't too bad. Plus, by providing you with those clue tokens, you now have the means to draw that second card per turn, meaning that it's even easier to get those tokens if you need. Haunted Imitation is a 3-mana spin the wheel kind of card, and I'm all about that. This is a pretty sweet way of making tokens, assuming you have a way to manipulate the top of your library, which newsflash, blue does. I think if you can even only guarantee the creature you have on top, it's still worth doing, since you have the potential upside of hitting random good creatures from your opponents at the same time. Like a lot of the other effects in this deck, the token comes in as a 1/1 spirit token with flying, but you do get the ETB triggers, which is pretty sweet. What's even better about this spell is that if somehow in response an opponent forces you to mill your top card, meaning you lose that creature, if you don't hit any creatures, the spell itself forces itself back into your hand, meaning you get to try again another turn. Occult Epiphany is one of 2 new instants, and it's a fun draw spell with upside. You pay X in a blue, and get to draw X cards, but are forced to discard X cards. To make things even better, for each card type that gets discarded, you get to make a 1/1 spirit token. This is a great way to basically help build up your board to have blocks, or prepare yourself for an alpha strike the next turn, since you're able to potentially get up to something like 6 extra spirit tokens, if you need to. The next creature we have is a Spectral Arcanist, and this is for all intents and purposes a tribal spirit torrential Gearhulk. It is a bit more demanding on what you cast, since you're only able to cast an instant or a sorcery with a converted mana cost equal to or less than the amount of spirits you control on the board. Obviously beyond that, it's also a bit of a downgrade since you're losing flash and getting flying instead, but I guess that makes sense as you're shifted from mythic to rare. You won't be using this to win any counter wars unless you have ways of flashing stuff out, but even still, flashing back instants and sorceries is always pretty sweet, and not having to pay the cost is even sweeter. The last instant of the deck and the last new card is Disorder in the Court, and this is probably one of the more interesting cards of the deck. For X, white, and a blue, you get to exile X amount of target creatures and investigate that many times. Unfortunately though, this isn't permanent exile, as the creatures do come back under their owner's control. What I like about the card is that it can be used offensively and defensively. You can use it on your own creatures and get a bunch of clue tokens, saving them from a potential board wipe, and then getting their enter the battlefield triggers as they come back, or you can use it on opponents' creatures to clear the way as you attack in and kill them. I'm very excited to test out this card, and I look forward to casting it and getting a bunch of clue tokens. Also, once more, this is another kind of card where Academy Manufacturer is obviously a great card to have out when you cast it. Well gang, those are all the brand new cards in Innistrad Crimson Vows Spirit Squadron deck. If you're looking for the full deck list, be sure to check out the video description as I've included a link to the full deck list. It's got a bunch of cool cards like Draw Skull Captain and Geist of St. Traft, so be sure to pick it up when it hits stores. As always, thanks to Wizards of the Coast for sending me this deck reveal, and be sure to remember that friends are just opponents you haven't eliminated yet.